July 25th, 2021. Episode 12, The Other World Just Beneath Our Noses. 21st day of Flame Rule. Weather forecast, moderate temperatures, gentle breeze. We traversed the wild landscape of the Misty Forest for about 3 hours. A rather exhausting hike, before finally coming across the mushrooms we had been looking for. All of us were happy to begin collecting. After having gathered some myself, I realized I had a lot less in my bag than I thought I should. I looked around and went back to collecting more, this time knowing for certain that some of the mushrooms I had gathered were disappearing. I asked the others if they had noticed. Everyone seemed to think I was being crazy. I know it had been a bit of a weird day for me, but anyone with basic math skills could see what was going on here. I pointed towards Sven, who had been rapidly throwing mushrooms into his bag like a dog throws dirt when digging. Moose wanted to believe me, so she inspected Sven's bag and she noted that he also had way less mushrooms than he should. Kyrax, who had also made her way over to inspect Sven's bag, witnessed one of the mushrooms disappearing right before her very eyes. With Moose's help, she was able to jump on the bag and close it up. She held it up high above her head and it was clear that something living was inside of the sack. She announced that I wasn't going crazy and that these creatures were invisible. They were eating the mushrooms we were collecting. I turned to look at my bag as she was explaining this, and one of the mushrooms I had collected came floating out, before something tripped me. I looked down to find vines tangled around my feet. I reached for the knife in my boot so I could begin cutting myself free of the dumb vines, when something appeared right in front of my face. It was very tiny and orange. I had to practically go cross-eyed to get a good look at it. It was a fairy dragon, and as I realized this, a flash went off, blinding me instantly. I began to panic, but thankfully the blindness didn't last long. Once my vision returned, albeit a bit spotty, I reached down again to cut myself free of the vines. While I was doing that, the creatures made to pull Kyokyojo's sword free of its hilt. Good thing he noticed and was able to hold on to it. Once I had stood up again, I started to reach for my bag, but I was knocked down a second time. Thane was laughing at my misfortune, but was jerked back by the neck area while making his way towards me. He turned to see a good-sized rock had been placed over the bottom of his cloak. These little creatures, now visible, were basically bullying us. And they wouldn't leave us be. That was, until one of the fairy dragons pulled at the thread on the guard of Sven's great sword. He reacted by drawing the blade at his belt and swinging wildly. This finally seemed to scare the creatures off, as we watched them fly up and away. The one Kyrax was holding onto in Sven's bag also seemed to be in a hurry to flee, so she let it go. We watched it fly off and finally, we could go back to collecting the mushrooms in peace. Some time passed and we decided to take a little break. We picked a spot near a small river to set up a camp. Moose took the opportunity to catch a fish and she was sure to show it off. Sven told her to bring one just like that, to the next dinner party we go to. Moose then took a seat near me, as she went about feeding her gelatinous cube a mushroom. I had been looking over my book when a familiar sound filled my ears again. I asked everyone at camp if they could hear the music and just like before, none of them could. I stood up and began to follow the sound. I soon recognized that there was another cave right by the spot we had chosen. I turned back to the group to tell them that I could hear the same music coming from the cave. I asked if anyone would be willing to go look with me. I could see the doubt on all of their faces, but I couldn't let it stop me. I turned back and was surprised to look down and see Kyokyojo standing right beside me and saying, "Let's go check it out." He actually went into the cave ahead of me. He claimed to see nothing just like before, but when I walked into the cave, I could see them. Gold fairies all around just like the last time. They were circling the water and forming into one larger fairy made up of the many. It pained me to see their one wing still incomplete. Kyokyojo left the cave. He did appear a little perplexed as he walked out, but I couldn't really be bothered with him at the moment. I was being greeted and having console with what felt like my old friends. I apologized for not being able to start their quest sooner, as we were still in the midst of our current quest. They didn't seem angry or upset about it, but they didn't provide me with any more answers. I asked them why they had called me back to see them again. They answered with telling me that I had been the one seeking them out. I shook my head, not understanding. I then turned and began to take my leave, unsure of what more I could say. I said a proper goodbye as I walked out, and I could hear them returning the gesture. Their voices were getting quieter when I noted a certain word in particular. I guess it was what I hadn't been able to hear them say the last time, the word, princess. I lifted an eyebrow as Moose came running up to me, and that was when it occurred to me once again, how strange that whole thing was. Sven echoed cave madness at me once more. I suggested that if he didn't believe me, he should go look for himself. I glanced up at Kyokyojo, and made a point in bringing up how this cave had looked exactly like the first one we had been in, back when we had first entered the Misty Forest. I could tell Sven wanted to brush me off, but I think the pointed stare Kyokyojo was giving him convinced him to at least go check it out. He made his way into the cave and came out a few minutes later. When I asked him what he saw, he said, "It's weird that the two caves look so similar, but all caves look alike." Why would I have thought that either one of those two would have been helpful to me in this situation? I know the Fae are notorious for being tricky. I've heard stories, but I really think something more is going on here. I just want to know why I'm the only one seeing and hearing these things. And at this rate, I'm not confident that I can convince anyone in my group that I'm not crazy or suffering from cave sickness, or whatever the hell he keeps calling it. Not too much longer after the cave incident, we decided to pack up our little camp and get back to work. The plan was to get done and out of the Misty Forest before nightfall, so we would need to get moving to reach that goal. Once we were packed up, we got back to trekking through the forest. Another hour passed, and it was around that span of time that we realized Leda Goldbean, the proprietor of our quest, was missing. We began to look around and call for him, knowing he hadn't been gone for more than a couple of minutes. Off in my peripheral vision I could see movement. I turned to see a mass of shifting vines a slight distance away. And there, in the center of them, was what appeared to be a mouth with Leda's boot sticking out of it. I quickly alerted my group to the monster eating our guide a mere 30 feet away. I would learn later from Kyrax that this monster was known as a shambling mound. Kyokyojo made to attack the vine-like being first, by striking it with a fiery chromatic orb. Not sure what he was thinking, considering Leda was still in the monster's mouth, but, lucky for all of us, the fire proved to be ineffective against this beast. It seemed that the vines were too soaked with water to catch on fire. Moose ran in next and attempted to pull Leda free, but only succeeded in pulling his boot off. Now there was no sign of the shopkeeper, as he seemed to have been completely swallowed by the shambling mound. I thought he might be lost to us until Kyrax moved in on the monster. She somehow managed to stronghold its mouth open with one hand, all while reaching into its throat and grabbing Leda by the ankle with the other. She then tore him free of those vines with ease, pushing him behind her and out of danger in the process. Kyrax really is a force all her own sometimes. She is truly amazing. Leda, now free, retreated to the back of the line where Thane and myself had been standing, left to cower in Thane's shadow. Now that we no longer had to worry about him being in danger, we refused to hold back with our magic. I used Ray of Frost upon hearing Thane suggest ice against this creature. This seemed to work much better than the fire had, or it at least made a noticeable difference. Moose was able to shock the creature at one point with shocking grasp. And after seeing Sven able to hit the monster with his sword, Thane and Kyokyojo eventually moved into close quarters combat with the beast. The fight with this shambling mound lasted a while, despite our vast array of attacks. I guess these creatures are resilient, so because of this I opted to use Chromatic Orb. I was hoping for a more devastating blow to end things faster. The issue with that was, at least 4 or 5 of my friends were surrounding it at close range. And unfortunately, this time, my aim was just a little off. I hit Sven right in the back with the full brunt of that spell. Oops. No, in all seriousness, I did feel terrible about this. I tried to yell out a warning when I saw the spell fly towards him, but it was too fast. Sven remained on his feet somehow, after taking the hit dead on, acting as though it hadn't even hurt him, which I don't believe. It wasn't until the monster was down that I was able to run up to him and apologize properly. I bowed and offered him my only healing potion. Sven swallowed all of the liquid in one shot, and then threw the glass bottle. He then leaned towards me and said, "I don't get mad, Siluca, but I do get even." He followed up his words with a smirk. "And also, he does get mad. I've seen it." So, after the shambling mound had retreated into itself, Kyrax wanted us to make sure we actually killed it, as a way of ending its suffering. Once we had properly dealt with the creature, we decided to get to wrapping up our quest. I'm pretty sure Leda was ready to leave after almost being eaten alive. Who could blame him? We started making our way back in the direction we had come from, but as we made that walk, we were quickly realizing that nightfall was coming. And it was coming fast. Leda, who had been leading the group, was urging us to pick up the pace. I could see that he was panic-stricken as he turned to us with a look of urgency. "We don't want to be here when night comes," he told us, his fear forthcoming. "We need to get out of here, and fast." His warning didn't fall on deaf ears as we all started to run, but the Misty Forest is not such a simple hike. The landscape is treacherous and vaster than one would believe. If Leda hadn't been there to lead us, I wonder if we would have gotten lost. Especially as the darkness of night fell upon us. It was getting harder and harder to see, until a slight glow appeared around us. I thought maybe Moose had casted dancing lights, but that wasn't the case. I looked up to find these dog-like creatures instead. They were ghostly, undead-looking beings, truly terrifying, and they were surrounding us from both sides. These creatures were fiends and not something we wanted to face. And they were gaining on us fast. The thought that this might be the end for us came to my mind, but then the movement around us ceased. The creatures surrounding us had paused in their tracks, their gazes all fixated on one person in particular, Sven. So many questions were running through my mind. It was bewildering, and I had to know why, but there also wasn't time. We were prompted to keep running, especially now that the pursuers no longer wanted to give chase. It was still absolutely vital that we get out of the forest. My curiosity got the better of me and I casted Detect Magic despite the urgency, and then I could see it. The sword Sven carries on his back was emitting necromancy magic. The only type of magic I had yet to have seen come from it, and high levels of it at that. I must have gasped and reacted outwardly to this by slowing down too much. Everyone kept shouting at me to keep running. I started to try and tell my friends what I was seeing, and then my legs went out from under me. I had been scooped up by Sven against my will. I asked him what the hell he was doing, both miffed, and yet somewhat impressed as well. So, after getting over the shock of that, I explained to him what was happening with the large blade sheathed on his back. The monsters were no longer following us as we ran out of the brush of the Misty Forest. We had made it out. What a relief it was to look up and see a clear night sky versus the tops of trees. We decided to camp for the night a little ways away from the forest. It had been an exhausting day for all of us, but I still had so many questions on my mind about what had happened back there. Once we had a fire built and we had settled around it, I looked to Sven sitting across from me and I began to ask him more about where he got that strange sword. What ended up following was a long story about Sven's village and what had been expected of him. Sven's people live in such difficult terrain and climate that surviving the winter puts families at brutal odds. Which adds up, considering he claimed to have been from beyond the spine when we met him, something I hadn't believed at first. This forces many to sell off their children to a group known as the Winter's Claw. Basically, the closest thing they have to a military from what I gathered, but on a much smaller scale than I have ever heard of. It sounds as though Sven fully dedicated himself to being a warrior and fighting on behalf of this group his entire life. He took pride in that and in being strong, as is customary for his people. It makes sense based on how we've witnessed him fight with us, but unfortunately, where there are armies, there is also wars to be won. And when the battles end and the strong come out on top, the weak are often slain. Every one of them. even those who have never had the strength to hold a weapon in their hands before. This is where Sven showed us that he harbors deep regret. He could hold no pride in defenseless people being executed, and he is clearly burdened by his own inaction to stop it during that moment. I could witness some anguish coming from him as he admitted this guilt to us. I tried to tell him that one moment doesn't define him. After all, many of us wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for his constant need to act even in the face of consequence for himself, myself included. I could see Moose looking thoughtful before Sven offered me a bit of his flask after I said this. I muttered, "What the hell?" before reluctantly taking a drink of it. I couldn't bring myself to say no when he was confessing all of this personal information to us. Sven went back to telling us his tale. How all of this forced him to desert the Winter's Claw, which also meant he would have to leave his home, but not before getting one last look at his people's most prized possession. The legendary sword that they revered and kept at the center of their great hall. Sven referred to it as Chainbreaker, or Fenrir's Tooth. Some fabled it to be cursed, others blessed. Whichever it may be, Sven decided he would take it with him. And so he did, with the intention of never returning to Scrottlefell. And as Sven continued, I could see him alluding to living the life of a warrior, which in his mind means to die as a warrior. Being led to the gates of Valhalla, to be amongst other great warriors and gods, such as Thor and Odin. His beliefs seem to align with some of the stories I've heard regarding the Death Domain. They speak of how everything will die, and the Death Domain will ensure balance on a good day. But the antagonistic forces in the Death Domain lend to destruction and chaos. Now I know why Sven always charges into battle seemingly unafraid, and without any hesitation. I know these are his beliefs, but the reality of knowing this is kind of disheartening to someone like me. At some point in the night, sleep finally claimed each and every one of us. We were greeted with clear skies and cold air on the morning of the 22nd of Flame Rule. The rest of the journey was uneventful. The only hardship we experienced was a thunderstorm, before arriving back at the gates of Secomber on the 23rd of Flame Rule. And with that homecoming came the unexpected. End of chapter. Notes that Siluca doesn't or wouldn't know. Sven filled a flask up with some of the water from the cave. He later drank it on the journey home, and it made him view Siluca as regal, and as someone of importance. This only lasted for a little while. The only person who noticed his change in perspective was Moose.